Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy.
Here, what does the Buddha say about human beings' inherent moral character?
He usually does not say much about the topic. He clearly lays out the work we have to do to achieve moral perfection and purity, but he doesn't comment on whether or not this is aligned with or contrary to our original nature. Why do you ask?
Just curious based on what I have heard from other masters and philosophers. They make lots of proclamations about human nature and moral character, and they say we are born moral and learn immorality, or vice versa.
I suppose the Buddha would take issue with the frame of the question. Human beings have no inherent character at all, no original moral inclination.
In the end, I suppose moral good and moral bad are dependently arising dualisms, insufficient for understanding ourselves and the world around us accurately.
Right you are. The characteristic of human beings is the same as that of samsara, potentially good or potentially bad depending on what we all make of it.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we will be discussing human nature in Buddhism. Does Buddhism regard human nature as inherently good or bad? Do other religions adjacent to Buddhism regard human nature as inherently good or bad? What does all of this mean in practice? We hope you enjoy. So let's get to it. Does Buddhism regard human nature as inherently good or bad?
The question of the inherent moral character of human nature is really a philosophical question. However, it can be applied to religious traditions, such as Buddhism, Christianity, and Hinduism, but also textual philosophies like Taoism, Confucianism, Kantian ethics, and so on. We've talked extensively about Buddhism as a philosophy versus Buddhism as a religion, so I won't go over that too much here, but I do want to say that when you apply a question like this one to Buddhism, you get extremely fascinating and complex answers and interpretations. I'd like to start by defining the parameters of the question. Human nature refers, essentially for our purposes, to the instincts, inclinations, and proclivities of human beings in the total absence of learned norms, values, and mores. These learned things can be thought of as being laid on top of human nature, whether it is good or bad, and so cannot fall under the scope of our discussion. Human nature is just what we are really like. It is a lion's nature to hunt and eat meat, and it is not a tree's nature to run around in the forest. In the realm of moral philosophy or ethics, the question of human nature is the following. In the absence of learned behaviors, are human beings naturally morally good or naturally morally bad? The way that moral good and moral bad are defined depends on the philosophical school of thought in question. For example, Confucianism regards human nature as base, animalistic, driven by instinct and hunger and greed, and therefore is morally bad. Moral good has to be taught and learned, which leads to the strong emphasis on education in Confucian philosophy. In this case, we'll be evaluating human beings' moral nature according to the moral system laid out by Buddhism itself. In Buddhism, moral good is captured and defined by the precepts: abstaining from killing, stealing, wrong speech, using intoxicants, practicing sexual indiscretion, and all of the rest that we've discussed before. If you practice these abstentions, that is good, and if you don't abstain from doing those things, that's bad. Buddhism, being as varied and diverse as it is across history and geography, has different answers to the question of the original moral nature of human beings. Earlier Buddhism and Theravada Buddhism both regard human nature as being originally morally bad. Human beings arise in samsara and thus share the same inherent characteristics that samsara has. These characteristics are the three dharma seals: emptiness, impermanence, and suffering. They view samsara in its original and inherent nature as being inclined toward traits and situations which contribute to and even cause suffering, and becoming enlightened is a matter of overcoming that magnetic attraction that samsara has towards suffering. Don't take the impression that Theravada or early Buddhism regards samsara as completely and necessarily bad, because awakening is totally possible. They just say that it is difficult given the stream of causality as it is and as it presents itself to us. Mahayana is much more affirming of samsara as it is, but awakening is no less difficult. First and foremost, emptiness, one of the three Dharma seals, becomes extremely more emphasized in the Mahayana over the others, and because of its nature as superseding dualities, it transcends conventional morality. Because of that, the question of the moral character of samsara is now much more challenging. Emptiness is regarded as the foundation for both moral good and moral bad, and thus the onus is much more on the practitioner to understand how to navigate that difference. Moreover, human beings, of course, share that nature of emptiness with samsara, so their moral nature is now much more in question as well. Nevertheless, Mahayana seems more optimistic than Theravada in its regard for morality and emptiness. Emptiness is the foundation for moral good because if you understand emptiness, you necessarily act morally better, and acting morally better leads to a better understanding of emptiness. Emptiness can be a foundation for moral bad, but only inasmuch as the stream of reality can be misunderstood by human beings because of their delusions and ignorances. One example of this happening in practice, according to the Buddhists, is the nihilists. Because they misunderstand emptiness, Buddhists say that they are inclined towards seeking sensory pleasure and avoiding sensory displeasure no matter what, and that's immoral. This may or may not be a valid critique of nihilism, but it is out there in the texts.
So, Mahayana sees emptiness as the foundation for moral good. Do you think it would be accurate in the Mahayana context to say that a lack of understanding of emptiness is a cause for moral bad?
That is one cause of moral bad, especially in the context of the behavior of sentient beings. However, we should talk about how the doctrine of emptiness is regarded as being the foundation for reality expressing itself as morally good or morally bad inherently, as well as understandings of it being important for human beings' moral behaviors. This has gone over in some of the Abhidharma texts. These are texts that are outside of the sutras and outside of the monastic rules and stuff. They're much more philosophical and they're a lot more complicated. There's far fewer translations of them into English, and so it's a lot more difficult to actually work your way through them. But they regard emptiness as being the original cause, because if we talk about this stream of causality as it is, and we judge that causality to be morally good or bad, the question then becomes what is the original cause, and we can't look in conventional time for that, because whenever we ask the Buddha, what is the origin of the universe? Was it the Big Bang? Was it Adam and Eve, etc., etc.? The Buddha doesn't answer. He famously gives no answer to that. So we have to look outside of conventional time to these sort of characteristics or these concepts or these ideas such as emptiness. These are the original cause for the arising of reality as it is. And so the debate is now, emptiness is completely absent of moral character by itself because it transcends conventional morality. So if it is the original cause, then how can something morally bad happening come out of this kind of uncharacterized, karmically neutral entity, or even a karmic entity or idea? So emptiness definitely gets reshaped into an actual thing rather than an actual idea, and becomes the original cause. And there's a lot of debate over sort of how this original cause leads to causes that we see around us, because we see moral good whenever we witness monks overcome aging, illness, and death and reach enlightenment, but we also see moral bad whenever we see animals kill each other, for example. So this is sort of a very complicated, very philosophical question that goes on specifically in the Mahayana, and not really that much, to my knowledge, in the Theravada or in the earlier Buddhist schools that predate both.
Okay. That answers my question as much as that question can be answered, I suppose. It's a question whose answer is there isn't really an answer, / every answer is correct, / none of the answers are correct.
Exactly. So later in Mahayana Buddhism's history, emptiness, being the critical characteristic of samsara as it is, becomes aligned with or synonymous with Buddha nature. This is the most optimistic view of samsara that we can see in Buddhism's history. If Buddha nature is the fundamental nature of samsara, then human beings share that nature because we arise in it. And if Buddha nature is the inclination of reality, then it is the natural inclination of human beings as well. In that scheme, we are originally morally good, but our learned behaviors and our delusions and all of our ignorance must be unlearned, and we must overcome it. While this version of Buddhism is more optimistic about the nature of reality, it does not sell short the difficulty of overcoming our learned behaviors and delusions. In other words, although these strains of Mahayana become ever more optimistic about the inherent moral nature of reality, they don't always regard awakening as being easier than the Theravada Buddhists do. This is where a lot of Westerners who have been enchanted by Mahayana Buddhism get tripped up. They buy into insufficient translations and interpretations, and the anti-Theravada sniping that goes on in Mahayana texts, and they come to believe that Theravada is the pessimistic, world-negating, and difficult way to enlightenment, and that Mahayana is the optimistic, world-affirming, and easy way to enlightenment. Neither of these descriptors is really appropriate for either tradition. One example of this is the Mahayana school of Tendai Buddhism, which we have discussed in the past. Although they have the doctrine of original enlightenment, which means that all human beings, all sentient beings, are originally enlightened at their very core, they still have to study and train for 12 years on Mount Hiei in Japan. That's not quote-unquote easier or more quote-unquote optimistic than Theravada monks doing essentially the same thing. They're working towards similar goals, but they're doing it in very different ways.
I will say one counterpoint to the idea of Mahayana being easier is Pure Land Buddhism. Now, my understanding of Pure Land Buddhism is more powered by reverence for bodhisattvas and faith in bodhisattvas rather than Buddha nature, which is what you were talking about here. But there are Mahayana schools that do list pretty trivially easy ways to become enlightened through faith.
It's absolutely true. In fact, as we've read in the Pure Land Sutras, we haven't read all of them, but we've read a couple. Amida himself, when he's making his bodhisattva vows, he says, if somebody just calls out my name 10 times with a sincere heart, then they'll be born in my Pure Land. And when they're born in my Pure Land, that's their last stop before they reach total nirvana. So that does seem at its face very trivially easy. And a lot of interpreters over history and a lot of practitioners over history do treat it that way. However, there are also some debaters in that side of things that say that the difficulty is no longer the study and the meditation of the texts and the practice of loving kindness and compassion. Those things are still there. Those things are still very important, but they're just not the hardest part. The hardest part actually is having true faith in Amida. So there's this distinction between sincere faith, the sincere heart that calls out Amida's name, or the non-sincere heart, I guess, the self-oriented heart. The true faith is really no faith at all, actually. It's a gift that Amida gives to you. So you're not really participating in the faith at all. It's in you because Amida has given it to you as a gift. And so you have to come to an understanding of non-self in the frame of that faith in order to have it be realized by Amida's vow. Because self-oriented or self-powered faith doesn't really get you anywhere. It's sort of a selfish and a self-motivated discrimination that you're making between something that works and something that doesn't work. And so that gets very complicated as well. I would be remiss without mentioning the Bodhisattva path and how it becomes more emphasized in Mahayana Buddhism as well. That path comes with certain specific moral prescriptions that we don't really see that much prior to the popularization of Mahayana Buddhism. The root of the Bodhisattva path is to always act toward the betterment of the situation of all sentient beings. And in reality, that frequently looks like giving alms, observing loving kindness and compassion, feeling great pity and sympathy for the suffering of all living beings, and acting only in ways that save every sentient being everywhere.
Do other religions adjacent to Buddhism regard human nature as inherently good or bad?
We have to discuss this question because Buddhism never existed in a vacuum, and it certainly doesn't now. These other religions interacted and exchanged with Buddhism and even influenced it. So we will be talking about human nature in Hinduism, Confucianism, Taoism, and Christianity. I should preface this whole discussion by saying that my discussion of the praxis of these religions and some of the philosophy and text of these religions will lack a great deal of nuance because I don't study them specifically for a living. I'll have to generalize and essentialize them in some places, and I apologize for that in advance. In Hinduism, we have talked about how one of the main ideas is that the human beings have a soul, which is called the Atman, and this soul is a piece of ultimate reality and universal reality, known as Brahman. By following one's duty throughout life, one can achieve unity between the Atman and Brahman through a process called liberation, or moksha. In this sense, the world we live in, samsara, is regarded as being the realm of suffering, and liberation from that world is the key to all things perfect and pure. However, unlike in Buddhism, the nature of Atman is not the same as the nature of samsara. The nature of the Atman is the same as the nature of Brahman, ultimate, perfect, pure reality. This is what makes liberation possible. Because of this, human nature must then be morally good. However, human beings have ritual responsibilities to the Hindu pantheon, and improper or inadequate performance of these rituals result in a person failing to fulfill their duty, or dharma. In that sense, the very existence of a system of moral duty being imposed on people as the sole means for liberation implies that human nature is inherently morally bad, and moral good is only achieved when one observes their dharma. Thus, whether human nature is morally good or bad in Hinduism is actually an open question. Moving on to China, where Confucianism and Taoism were the two primary ways of thinking at the time of Buddhism's arrival, we have a couple of different streams of interpretation. In our example earlier, Confucianism regards human nature as inherently morally bad because moral uprightness has to be taught to people by means of study of the Chinese classics, which document what the world was like under the rule of these mythologized sage kings. These sage kings were highly educated, extremely morally good, and existed in a very harmonious and prosperous society as a result. This can be attributed to the context under which Confucianism developed in China, which was the Warring States period. Confucius looked around and saw only power-hungry, greedy, and warlike people improving their own lot by means of exploiting those around them, and so regarded human nature as inherently bad. Additionally, he was looking back to this idealized past, the Zhou dynasty, which existed about 1,000 years before Confucius did, where these mythologized sage kings ruled. The Taoists, on the other hand, believed a little bit differently. They regarded original human nature as inherently morally good, and they believed that education further distanced people from that nature. In Taoism, our original nature is the same nature as that of the Tao. We can loosely translate this word Tao as the way, and it's kind of regarding the pattern and means by which the world around us unfolds. That's kind of where the word way comes in. It's the way of the world, which is spontaneous and energetic and morally good. Flowers bloom by making use of a spontaneous, infinite, and free natural energy that propels reality forward. Just like flowers, so too are babies spontaneous, energetic, and natural. They don't have any knowledge, learned habits, or learned notions about the world that separate them from its true nature and from their true nature. Thus, they regard human nature as inherently good. Finally, Christianity has a variety of views as well. Man is made in God's image, and God is representative of ultimate moral perfection and purity. And so, one might think that human nature ought to be regarded as originally morally good in Christianity. However, because human beings are encumbered by original sin, their human nature is actually morally bad. This can be seen through an examination of their doctrine of exclusivity. Salvation is only possible by accepting the Christian God as one's own savior. As such, the argument is that moral good and moral perfection is not possible for every human being. It's only possible for those human beings who practice the 10 Commandments, have faith in the Christian God, and read and study the Christian Bible. Even people who practice the 5 precepts, which all come up in the 10 Commandments, are still not morally perfect people because they are practicing the 5 Buddhist precepts and not the 10 Christian Commandments. The Christian system is the only valid system, and so being outside of that system is regarded in Christianity as morally bad.
What does Buddhism and other religions' regard for human nature mean in practice?
How a particular way of thinking regards human nature determines what that way of thinking argues that human beings ought to do. It is the why behind the what we ought to do. We'll start by mentioning how this goes in other religions, and then we will come back around to Buddhism. Again, I would like to preface this by saying that these other religions are not my subject of study, and so I will have to generalize and essentialize, and I apologize in advance. In Hinduism, fulfilling our dharma or duty is a reflection of how human nature is interpreted. On the one hand, we fulfill that dharma by learning the content of the texts and the rituals and their purposes because we have inherently inadequate or bad moral natures, and we have to do that. On the other hand, dharma is fulfilled because our natures are inherently good, and fulfilling our dharma is what we do naturally. In Confucianism, they emphasize that human nature is not good as it is, and so we must learn and be taught. Thus, the Confucian ideal is a very scholarly and very learned person who has studied the Chinese classics and who applies what they read and learn in those texts into all that they do. In Taoism, which regards human nature as inherently and originally good, the opposite is the case. Being educated in the classics is going in the wrong direction. Instead, study of the Taoist text is emphasized. Additionally, lots of ascetic and meditative practices that are taking place away from civilization and out in nature are emphasized as a means of regaining that moral purity and perfection that we're born with, but we lose through education. In Christianity, because humans are encumbered by original sin, human beings have to repent and accept the Christian God, who is the image of moral perfection and purity, as their savior. He then absolves them of their sin and welcomes them into himself. In Buddhism, since we have a variety of answers to the question of humans' moral nature, we have a variety of practices that come out of those answers. In early and Theravada Buddhism, since the nature of samsara is inclined towards suffering and delusion and ignorance, which leads to immorality, we have to learn the true nature of everything. We have to study the sutras and meditate as a means of overcoming our delusions. We have to free ourselves of this samsaric character we have by means of coming to know awakening and nirvana. This requires achieving omniscience by unlearning our delusions and learning the true nature of how everything really works. And I really do mean everything in this context. In Mahayana Buddhism, we're prescribed to do similar things but to different ends. We have to come to realize our true and actual nature as being emptiness or Buddha nature or original enlightenment. This happens through different methods of meditation or different rituals. For example, instead of mindfulness of body and breathing, or instead of meditation on a specific doctrine or characteristic of something, we are called upon to meditate by means of slowing the stream of perception to the point where you are, quote, just sitting, to realize our original enlightenment as in Zen, or by means of aligning your body, speech, and mind with that of the Buddha in order to realize the non-dual nature between you and him, as in esoteric Buddhism. When encountering a religious practice, see if you can infer what the religion believes about the moral character of human beings through that practice as an exercise. This is useful because some people don't really go for traditions that regard human nature as inherently bad. Many don't like to show up to something and immediately be made to feel like they've done something wrong. Additionally, even if you're analyzing a ritual or practice from your own religion, it's still a useful exercise so that you're more aware of what you are doing and why you're doing it.
We hope you enjoyed this week's discussion of human nature in Buddhism and other religions surrounding it. Join us next week, where we will discuss Buddhism's arrival in China. What is the story of Buddhism's arrival into China? How did this affect Confucianism and Taoism? How does this influence Chinese Buddhism going forward? We hope to see you there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and voice of Hearer.
And I'm Dox, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has meant Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com or find us on Mastodon at brightbuddhism@mstdn.party. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.